All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today, for taking an hour out of your week, an hour out of your time to join us here at the Praxis Forum, join us for this quarterly conversation that we have 4 times a year. This is our third conversation in our year of conversations, and we have talked about environmental justice, we've talked about racial justice, and tonight we're going to be speaking about empire, which is an appropriate subject, being that in 1 hour we will have our vice presidential debate. I promise we will be on time, and so we can all go and watch that debate at 9 o'clock Eastern time. Today we are talking about, it's Gods and Kings is the title, the presence of empire from the Bible to today. And I am speaking with the Reverend Winnie Varghese. She is a priest on the strategic clergy team at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Before arriving at Trinity, Reverend Varghese was the rector of St. Mark's in the Bowery here in New York City, which is a historical Episcopal congregation here in New York City. From 2003 to 2009, she served as the Episcopal chaplain at Columbia University. From 1999 to 2003, she served as the curate at St. Albans in Westwood and Episcopal chaplain to UCLA. She is a graduate of the Union Theological Seminary here in New York City with her Master's of Divinity, and she graduated with the Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from Southern Methodist University. That is her official bio. I'll give her an opportunity to introduce herself momentarily. This is a conversation that we have at the Praxis Forum, as I said, on a quarterly basis. All the conversations this year are centered around the theme of formations on earth as it is in heaven. And this is an open conversation for anyone who wants to partake in this conversation. We also have another conversation next month, which will be specifically for Praxis members, where we will talk about this conversation, debrief the conversation, be able to answer more questions and have a more of a conversational approach to the conversation. And so I invite anyone who is not yet a member of the Praxis Forum to join the Praxis. It's an organization or a part of Westar that is where we support the religious literacy and the religious work of the scholarly work of Westar, and we bring it to the practitioners, people who do on the ground work as practitioners of religion. And so we are really focused on that intersection of theory and theology and philosophy, and also work, practice. So that's how we get our name, the Praxis, which is that intersection. And so you can see on your screen right now that we are one of the 3 different memberships that are offered through Westar. We have the associate membership, which is the base membership, which is $5 a month. You can also get an enhanced associate membership, which gives you a few more perks that you can see there on your screen. It's $10 a month, and Praxis is a $6 a month membership, which gives you everything that the associate membership provides, as well as a few extra items that you can see there. You can see the screen going down. If you would like to register, if you're not a member of Westar and you'd like to become one, you can go to our website at the westarinstitute.org, and you can find all of this information where you just click which kind of membership you would like, and then fill out your contact information. So I invite anyone who's not a member of Westar to do so tonight. And if you want to become a part of Praxis, I would really welcome you to do that. So thank you all for joining us, as I said, tonight for this conversation on empire. And so we're gonna go ahead and get the conversation started. Winnie, welcome. Thank you for I know you are a very busy person, and so thank you for taking some time out of your week. Would you like to just take a minute? I've read your official bio, but go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from, and however you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I feel very aware of not being a scholar. I'm a good enough student from Union that I'm very humbled by this organization and who is in this room and the work that you all do. So I'll do my best. Really honored to be invited. So my name is Winnie. I'm a priest at Trinity Church in New York City. Trinity Wall Street might be that title might sound a lot like it knows a lot about empire, actually. And we, in some ways, we're exactly what you think we are. In some ways, we're not. We're a place made of people trying to figure out how to bear witness in this time, to be faithful. My family is from India. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and I've been a priest for about 20 years, and really interested in the public voice of the church and how we as Christians in this country claim a moral voice and an ethical voice in this time, and what Jesus has to do with the state of things as they are, and still remain very connected to India and get to be there about once a year, and most of my extended family lives there, so that's the other part of my reality.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think that places you in a great context to speak about empire and the presence of empire. So as here at Westar, I'm not a scholar either. I'm a pastor, so I'm with you on that. But Westar Institute has done a lot of work on empire, and whether it's John Dominic Crossan, whether it's Ellie Elliott, we have a variety of scholars that do a lot of work on empire. And so I don't want to go over a tremendous amount of the presence of empire in the New Testament. However, I do have a question in how you understand the influence of empire whenever you open your Bible, whenever this relationship that we have with our scripture. How do you understand the presence of empire and the influence of empire as you encounter the scriptures?
Yeah, it makes me feel very old, but the presence of empire critical studies, of like thinking about this in this way, is so refreshing and powerful in this time, and so useful. But it's not a discipline that I was aware of even when I was in school. And what's interesting to me about how empire works in the Bible is from the beginning, it's clear that what empire is sort of neutral at the very beginning. If you go kind of back to Abraham, kind of at the beginning, it's power. It's a power over safety, right? Control over land and safe passage, power over people's lives. And it's clear from the very beginning of that notion in the text that we can be drawn in, right? That it's not necessarily after us. We have to decide how we negotiate it. So you see throughout the Hebrew scripture, you can see sometimes it's just conquest, but sometimes it's a nice place to live and the smart people get to live there, and all you got to do is eat a certain thing or bow your head a certain way. Like the accommodation that's allowed and permitted, which is more of the lived reality of most of us in this time, is clear throughout the text. In the New Testament, it's different. Like Jesus clearly lives in the shadow of a brutal empire, and that story is designed to tell us that and tell us about the brutality of empire. But I actually think it's a little bit more complicated before we get there, in ways that might have a lot to say to us about the kind of the spaces that most of us occupy.
Right. So we see everything from, the whole way that I studied with at Union as well. And so our Old Testament class 101 was told from the history of empires from the very beginning to the Roman Empire. And so can you talk about some of the complicated ways that you see present in the Bible that had to be negotiated, especially the New Testament? Westar is home of the Jesus Seminar, so we have more of a New Testament bent. But so what are some of the complications that you see present in the text, in the New Testament?
The New Testament, definitely more. It seems to be a little more complicated than the Old Testament. The New Testament, what is complicated about it? Well, I think the spread of the message that we have, right? The network that is Paul's, the churches that are established, his capacity to travel and communicate, and literally the establishment of the church, right? In the early period when it is at its most innocent, right, is because of the networks of empire, period. Right? It would not exist in this way. These stories don't exist in this way. Like empire is the tool of evangelism from the very beginning. And I actually think that's really complicated. That's a complicated thing to think about as a Christian.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Paul, because he does, talk about complication, he'll claim his Roman identity when it's convenient, and he won't when it's not. And so I'm interested in how empire is present at all times, whether we like it or not. And so how this might be a question for later, and how we experience empire just as we are, just as we live. But in understanding the Bible, should that be one of our foremost things that we need to keep in mind as we're reading? I know the Empire Critical Studies have really put that to the forefront. But it's something that needs to be studied, right? You wouldn't necessarily know that it's there if you're not taught about it. I guess the names of the Herod and all of them are present, but the impact of it is not. It's something that needs to be studied. So, is that something? Is this something that you use when you're teaching or when you're preaching? How do you embrace this piece of empire?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, again, so I'm not a scholar, and I know my friends who have different opinions about this, but we just celebrated, you know, I'm an Episcopalian, so we commemorate people, right? So we just did Tyndale and Coverdale, who bring the Bible into English, right? The great Bibles into English. So that and our prayer book comes about the same time. And part of the innovation of that in the 1500s was all of a sudden, if you were literate, which most people weren't, but people became literate because those translations are happening and the printing press is happening. Part of the great innovation of Protestantism is the text was free to you. You could have it. You could read it. And I do think it's a danger if scholarship takes the text too far from us. Of course, the other side of that argument, right, is that for 1500 years, most Western Christians didn't have it. They had whatever a clergy person might say in church, if they said it in a language they could understand, and images and windows. There was no text that was accessible to most people. And where my parents are from, if you could read Syriac, you had our text. You know, it wasn't in Malayalam until I think the 1900s or the late 19th century, if not the 1900s. So you just didn't have it. But Christians had been there. We had been Christian for 1800 years. So I think so one, you know, clearly there are ways to be a person of faith and to be a Christian person external to this engagement of the text. But I would also argue that for most Protestants, and at this point not for all Protestants, for all Roman Catholics as well, an engagement with the text, that the text is yours, that the word speaks to the text, is pretty primary to most of our faith, like our understanding of the faith. And so I think using interpretation and scholarship in a skillful way that doesn't alienate people from their own reading of the text is really important. If it becomes, you know, if we're too rarefied, I think if we make it too obscure, then we've taken the text from them. Like, they need us for the text. And that is the traditional teaching of the church, that they need us for the text. I don't think that's right. That's just not my politics. It's not my faith. So I do think we have to be careful. I try to point to where the text might be. I think the thing that's important to point to, because of how we're all kind of taught to read the Bible in our culture, by the culture, is where you see disruptions from kind of moral explanations or things like a prosperity gospel teaching, where you see something that is critical of the world that we live in, with an eye towards justice or an ethical way to be, that's disruptive or confusing or creates a complexity that that actually takes a little bit of training to see, because it's not how we're trained to see the text. But I think there's a way to do that points to those disruptions, and not to, if you read these 15 books, you might be able to read Mark correctly, you know, or that if you can read Greek. And I think there's a lighter touch way to do that, that still honors the scholarship. And I think there's a huge place for the scholarship, clearly, and that should inform our preaching and our teaching. But I do think that's a fine line, because I do believe the word acts through the text, and that's important.
Yeah, thank you. I heard you describe in a speech you gave, I think it was the Reformation Project in Los Angeles, you talked a little bit about how you grew up and where you were from in India and the importance of that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that and about the importance of Kerala, where you're from?
Yeah, my parents are from the Orthodox churches in South India, so they're both from Kerala. My mother is from the Jacobite Church, which is the Syrian Orthodox Church in Kerala, which all these other people will say they are the Indian, the Church of Thomas. What I love is that the Jacobite Church is the oldest church, is the original church of all of us, and they don't claim that, they don't say it that way. So all the churches called St. Thomas are a derivative of that church. So the Marthoma Church, which literally means Mars Saint, right? St. Thomas, which my father's a part of, and the other churches in that area that, and we all come from, those of us that are from that tradition were originally from the Jacobite Church, which then the breaks in that church. So the story of that church is, which I think is a fantastic story as stories go, is that Thomas got on a boat and he ended up in Kerala. So there's no documentation that he was actually there, though there are lots of stories that have survived, and that he dies in Madras as part of the story of Thomas in India, and that he comes to Kerala and converts some families, and that we are the descendants of those families. So what makes the story interesting to me and possible is there is a Jewish community in Kerala that is from that time and was there before that time. And so it would have made sense that there would have been boats that people traded with that community. That community got there in some way. Definitely a community is established after the fall of the temple. So by 70, there's absolutely a Jewish community in Cochin. But before that, it looks like there was as well. So it's very probable, it's not unlikely that people that would have known Jesus or heard of Jesus would have come to Kerala. And Kerala at the time was the center of the rice trade, some of the spice trade, the silk trade, because you could get to Kerala, we're on the west coast from the Middle East, and then go around the tip of India or go across land to Madras, and then you're in the eastern part of India. You can go up to Calcutta and you can go to China, you can go east. So Kerala, there's a land route through Afghanistan, there's a sea route through Kerala, and then rice would have come and spices through Kerala on boats through the actual state, and then would have gone to the Middle East and then to Europe. So we've been at the center of that kind of trade for at least a couple of thousand years that we're aware of, maybe longer. And there's great documentation of the Chinese and Romans in our architecture, having been there. So there's this really interesting history, but the Christianity that emerges there never becomes the majority. So there are people that follow Thomas, and then the Syrians come on a trading mission in the 5th century. And because they've heard of these followers of Thomas, they then establish the Syrian church there. And that church, again, is never a dominant church. It's not an imperial church. It's a local church. And we are never the majority, but we're there. Our historical kind of existence is there. And when the Portuguese come, when the Dutch come, when the English come, they find it really bizarre that we are there. And the Portuguese come during the Inquisition, because kind of the tail end of the Inquisition is the colonial movement. Christopher Columbus went west and comes here. Vasco da Gama went east and comes to Kerala, because that old myth story is that Columbus was trying to get to India. It's not clear at all that that's what was actually happening, but if he was, that's where he was trying to go. And so Kerala is this object of empire, but is never itself, and so it's kind of on the receiving end, and isn't kind of an innocent rural place, right? Is a pretty sophisticated trading place. Like it is it's a worldly place, and would have been China and India at the time would have been the center of the world's economy. Both places were about 25% of the world's economy at the time. China, clearly a huge imperial power, India as well, but Kerala was would have been a distant, remote part of an empire centered somewhere else. And then Christianity emerges there and stays there until the Portuguese come and basically bring the Inquisition to us. And we were the wrong kinds of Christians. And so then it becomes a story of surviving.
So you grew up outside of that Western Empire existence, but then you became victim to it.
Well, very proud, like it may be false, but very, very proud that we are a community that stood up to it and survived underground and have retained culture despite colonial imposition. So I would say it's a little bit more complicated than that. And yet it's a really proud part of our own heritage. And then you kind of put on top of that, the British colonial period, which my father was alive for, and how Christianity came to India very unsuccessfully in many ways during that time, and then resistance to that as well within the churches that my family is a part of, and a lot of influence as well as resistance.
So how would that resistance, I guess, you see that at play in how they live out their faith or their religious life?
You know, I would say yes, and right, that yes, when I was growing up, and now that India in recent years under the Modi government has become so fundamentalist and nationalist with a
Mm-hmm.
different religion, but still fundamentalist nationalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can see Christianity becoming kind of joining up with that, kind of being fiercely Indian. But before that government, where that kind of played out is that we have ways that we worship locally and we retain them. We retain like local festivals and local practices. We are not fundamentalist evangelicals. We are not, going to do the service in English. We kind of, and you can hear a very Indian philosophy in the teachings of Christianity in Kerala. It sounds much more, frankly, like Hinduism often than it sounds like Christianity, except that we mean Jesus. Like we've got that, we've got those images. But when you listen to how people talk about how grace works, how life works, it sounds much more Indian than it sounds like the denomination we might be named, by.
Right. Thank you. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really, I hadn't heard that history of the church before, so it's fascinating to hear. And so you grew up in the United States. You grew up in Dallas, and I'm curious about the presence of empire here in the United States, and how we can understand. I think it's become more in this last since March, since the pandemic has hit. I think it's become right up front and center, if not before. I understand it's been from before, but how do you understand the role of empire as in today's world? And thinking, I'm just assuming that the United States is a world empire, and so how do you understand the role of empire in our lives today? How it functions?
Yeah, I think it's such a fascinating frame to use, right? So there's the obvious, which I would agree with you. The United States, by its military force, absolutely, right? We are a dominant world power. The way that's always framed in every empire that I've ever read about is internal to the empire. We call ourselves a force for good. We are peacekeepers. We are protecting our interests. We perceive that as a good, and I think a lot of good people within those systems perceive that as a good. When you're on the fringes of it, on the outside of it, subjugated to it, you have a different experience of it. So there's military, right? And that's us, it's China. And then there's economic, which is, I would say, transnational corporations. And so that's kind of the world my church lives in, that money, right? A very small number of people and their personal wealth, but also these enormous corporations that are much more powerful than most governments. And our government is subject to many of them. We do not have power over them. We cannot. We will not. That form people's lives, right? That mean that people live in abject poverty in this country, working multiple jobs, cannot take care of their health, absolutely subject to the corporation, and literally government cannot stand up to, or cannot sort out how to stand up to it. Cannot imagine another way. So that disruption of the particular of a person, of the bodies of the people that are workers, with these massive organizations. And then I would say the other part of kind of the empire piece is, one of the functions of empire is it occupies us at every level, like our imaginations, our our bodies, what color they should be, who we love, like every part of it is conformed, to empire. So how the powers and principalities work, right? How the angels work, like what, race, gender, all of those things organized to around a good that is, I would say, is this imperial good, right? So whether that's around labor or a national identity, or but all of these things, I would say, are in the service of this other thing, right? That promotes a kind of uniformity, wipes out particularity, wipes out human experience. Literally removes us from our own bodies by occupying our minds and imaginations with a way to be that for most of us is impossible, right, and for all of us is not right.
Right. It makes me think of the Romanitas, this idea of being Roman, and if you don't fall into being Roman, then you're considered other or barbarian in the Greek context. So part of the function of Praxis is to help practitioners. And I know that you've led a justice ministry. You have a lot of experience. You have experience with the homeless community, I think, out in California. So you have a lot of experience engaging in, I guess, victimization from empire, from the consequences of empire. I guess I can frame it like that. But I also think that it takes a toll on everybody. And so how do you resist the empire as an individual and also on a communal level? Yeah, I'll leave it as that, and you can take it as you will. How do we resist?
Yeah, I think one of the great writers on this is Arundhati Roy, right? And Vandana Shiva. Like, I betray my allegiances. I'm very much an Indian. You know, I think ecofeminism and ways of thinking that connect us to the earth, and to life, and to the particularity of ourselves and our bodies and the people around us. To me, that's the point of being a Christian, right? That we are asked to focus on a vulnerable body, and the kind of body we don't, and in all of its particularity, as this person walks through this really particular landscape. And what it draws us back to is our own createdness and our humanity, which is, you know, one of my experiences of being a young adult, working with unhoused people who are living with severe mental illness in Long Beach, is that I realized as a 22-year-old that I had been raised to believe, in all my very liberal, thoughtful Christian household, that the world was a threat to me, that people were out to take me, that I was unsafe in the world as a young woman, and a young woman of color, and a small person, a brown person, all these ways, that I was subject to violence or, you know, physical threat in some way, and that I should be afraid of these people who were suffering from impoverishment and sickness that was untreated, right, and addiction sometimes. And it hit me, like, it was so shocking, because I did my religious studies degree with faculty that went to Union, you know, and I knew what liberation theology was. I knew how to think about it, and I realized I'm scared. I didn't realize I was scared of my fellow human beings in this frame of safety that empire tells you about, where I was or at least I understood myself to be, which I wouldn't have even guessed at the time, kind of in a middle-class frame, a suburban middle-class frame, where everyone who was not an approved person to enter my household or my neighborhood was potentially a threat to me. And I was horrified that that's what I thought as I walked into these encampments of folks, where my job was to say, hey, do you know of anyone who needs some mental health help? Because we can do that. We can be alongside and be a friend. And that shattering of these illusions of our specialness and our kind of the protectedness, like basically our role is fundamentally as consumer, right? And safety is one of the things we consume, and we buy it by the plot of land we buy, and the car we drive, and the clothes we wear, and the education we have. That, to me, that is like, those were things that occupied my mind. And so the resistance to that is to put ourselves in positions where we're resisting those truths. And I actually think it takes a lot of unlearning and learning, because we have been taught to be in a very particular way, and taught that it's natural. You know, it's something that I feel like, as an older person, it's so striking to me that we teach our children to be afraid. I did it. We tell them to be afraid because we're told that's what keeps them safe. We teach them to be afraid of other people, right? And a lot of what the life of faith is to not be afraid, or to know that when you're afraid, you go there. That's the place you need to enter, right? That fear is, you know, Jesus says, do not be afraid. And I think that, like, that's the role of the faith community, is to actually contest those kinds of things that seem so safe and obvious, right? But actually mean that we are now separated from the most vulnerable people in our communities, and we too have criminalized them, right? Or have criminalized ourselves. As one of my friends says about, you know, about her kids, like watching her kids grow up and realize that they took it on before they had words, that they were dangerous to other people, right? Wow. Right. And so I think we've got to be vigilant in the same way that you want kids from before they can talk back to you about it to know that they are loved as they are. I think we've got to be critiquing, but I don't know that the critique needs like the big terminology. It just needs to understand how empire works, and we need to be pulling at those threads all the time.
You wrote recently on your blog, I think it was recently, I don't know when you wrote it actually, but on Pathos, about language, the importance of language. And I hear that echoed here a little bit. And thinking about the labels of Jesus in the Gospels, how they carry the names of Caesar. And so how powerful how how powerful is language that you just touched on, but also like what language, how do we start to learn a new language that when we're in a world that's very oppressive with language, I guess you could say. We're taught a very specific type of language to use.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and you see it in. I actually think we're in a really exciting time around language. I think because a lot of people are like the gift of people who are gender fluid claiming identity, and something about how we're able to share. And I actually think social media has a lot to do with this, and raise up. Because it seemed to me, at least when I was growing up, it was so easy for someone powerful to mock and shut down an innovation. I think that happened with a lot of inclusive language and expansive language in church spaces. All the people I grew up around mocked it, and assumed that anyone intelligent mocked it while we were all learning it. It always seemed like the most obvious thing to me. That of course, God is bigger than one pronoun. You know, or as my Jewish friends say, God has no pronoun, right? That we're able to contest this space of how our language is gendered, and that we're changing. It's changing right now in a way that it wasn't when I was 25. So I think we're actually in a really rich space. I think the challenge for us is a lot of that change is not happening within the church. It's happening external to the church, but we need to be changed by it. I would say, I'm one of those people who say, all we have is language. All we have is story. We have, like, as people, we got nothing else. You know, I'm a believer, and it's in some very traditional ways, but you know, so we have, this is a horrible illustration, but I'm trapped in my house. So all my illustrations are about my house. We get flies because our daughter leaves the door to the deck open. So we get flies in the summer sometimes. And we were talking about all the different ways we're trying to get rid of the flies. And so we were Googling it, and we discovered that the fly figures it out. Like if you screw up the trap one time, the fly learns and won't come back. The problem the fly has is it's not clear the fly can tell the other fly, right? And all we have is that we can tell our stories. We can tell each other, right? And so if we don't, like, we are framing our entire imaginations in the stories that we tell, including we can be framing a vision for the future so much greater than who we are in the stories that we tell. So, and a little example would be, I was preaching at something where there were a lot of people I didn't know. And I said, Jesus, who is gendered male at birth, and which is true. It's a neutral statement. And afterwards, there's a woman saying there with her child, like hiding behind her, like you hide behind your mom when you're nervous. And the woman came up and she was crying and said, just thank you. I made them come, and they identify in this way. And she explained that and said, and has never heard her experience reflected in the church and couldn't imagine that it could be reflected in Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And then they walked away. I was like, holy God, I was just being a little flip, you know, and a little whatever, provocative. And someone imagined themselves into this story of salvation because I was careful with my words. I mean, so I would say it's so powerful.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to open it up for questions momentarily. If you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand, but put it in the chat if it's all possible. And so we'll open that up shortly. So while people are formulating their questions, one question for you is that we here at Westar are in a progressive space. You know, we have our blind spots, but it would be described as a progressive space. What are some of the things we in these progressive spaces, and in regards, there's a lot that we need to be aware of, but what do we need to be careful of as we think about how we move forward working in this American empire, and combating or resisting the empire, but in a way that is living out the commandment of love. So I guess for you, what would you say is our blind spots that we need to be particularly aware of?
Yeah, I'll speak to mine because I would assume we share them because I don't know what yours are, but I'll speak to mine. One is that I have in me a great desire for there to be something that's right, you know, and maybe it's Christianity and empire is an easy one for me as an Indian. There are things that are wrong and things that are right. And I remember the first time I was in China and understood the impact of Buddhist monks in China, you know, that, and how horrible it was, frankly. They were as awful as hearing like stories of old monks in Europe, you know, and you can find the same about Hinduism in India, that empire can use anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are no pure paths, frankly. All the paths are being used, can be used potentially, can also not, but they can be forces of resistance, but those are choices that we make. And so we need to be really careful. And I say this to myself as an Episcopal priest, that if the Episcopal Church is not actively thinking about the full humanity of the most vulnerable, the stewardship of the earth, you know, our true responsibilities as parts of this creation, then almost by default, we become a tool of empire. And I would say that of any Christian in any kind of Christianity in this country. So I'm not the kind of Christian that would say, or the kind of religious person that would say there is a practice external to empire that you can have, that you can be a Buddhist in a certain way or a Christian in a certain way, that means that those are not your concerns. We cannot do that, in my opinion. So I think that's really important. And then I think it's important to know that the empire that we are, the foundation of the empire that we live in, which is genocide and slavery and land conquest. And so if we are not anti-racist and working really hard at it, no matter what the composition of our communities are, if, you know, like, it's a phrase that race is created in the service of racism, right? And racism, I would say, is one of those imperial powers. And that we have to be actively, we don't get to separate that out. And I live in a world where, you know, some people are more comfortable talking about being anti-war, or some people are more comfortable talking about class. All of those things are really important. And I think that it's got to be all together all the time. And we can't, as Americans, we cannot skip over race and slavery and conquest, land conquest. We got to stand in that. And it's the hardest one. And it's, you know, as the kids, it's awkward. You feel like the bad guy all the time. They're just smarter things to be talking about. Often class is the smarter thing there's other things to be talking about. I just think it is a liberal seduction to not work hard at being anti-racist, because, you know what, it's shaming to us. We're all going to get it wrong. We all have so much to learn. We all benefit so much, which is how empire works. Like Abraham had the choice of saying, here's how I can protect myself with the Pharaoh, right? From the beginning, we're all seduced by empire, you know, for safety. And we should see that as the primary seduction. I feel like we're taught from the beginning. We're not all just Jesus with no access and something else to proclaim. We all have some access. And, you know, we're more in the Paul spot, right? And you know, nobody wants to be Paul, but there we are.
Thank you. I don't think we have any questions. One question came up was, what was the relationship of the Kerala Christians to the British Empire? I think you answered that, but if
that's a great question. So it's very complicated. So again, in the same way that the Portuguese, the Jesuits actually were just disgusted by us. They found us to be very decadent and all kinds of things. We're not properly Catholic because we weren't. The evangelical missionaries did as well. They all just found us horrible, and yet wanted to claim the mission field, like wanted the numbers. And so some people in our communities from our converted. Some people found it just fascinating, right? Like definitely wanted access to education and found it interesting, because the way that the British came to India was not with armies. They didn't conquer India. It was through trade. They wiped out the markets, which is kind of what China is doing. Frankly, they overtook the markets. And then when Indian rulers were weak, local rulers, or didn't give them what they wanted in trade deals, then they occupied like small places at a time. So when the British came to Kerala, they were just these weirdos who needed our rice, and we've been selling our rice forever, and needed our pepper, and found us to be a mild climate, milder than the rest of India, and also Christian. And so they weren't a huge threat at the beginning. They were just different. And so we had Anglican communities and little missionary communities, and where my grandmother's from, they didn't convert. They just negotiated. The Anglicans negotiated with the Jacobite bishops and said, basically, you can have that diocese. It's a backwater. And so all these people became Anglican all of a sudden. And like one day they were Jacobite, and the next day they went to the same church, heard the same, nothing changed at church. They were just Anglican. So there's this weird And my mother's community comes from a place where the Anglicans hated us because we had a very strong Marian devotion, and we still do.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can find these missionary journals where they write about how just horrible we were, and really awful descriptions, racist descriptions of us and our bad practice, and our infernal chanting to Mary is one of the things I read. And this guy talks about going down to town, going to the church to just say, like, stop it, and preaching to them, I guess in English, I don't know how he did it, about how this was wrong and that we were all doomed to eternal damnation. And he writes in his journal, and it seemed that even with my best preaching or whatever, that their chanting just seemed to grow louder and louder. Like they drowned him out. So it was complicated. But I think for some in our communities, it was an interesting, different approach to teaching. And you had this text, you had this Bible all of a sudden, and some people were very interested. And others were in complete resistance and took vows to the death to never convert. And I come from that part of the community. So we have a lot of self-righteousness about that, and I totally feel it as well. It's more problematic than that. And then I would say the whole community, Dalit community that joined the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, had been excluded from our communities by caste. And it's not that the Romans or the English wanted them, they didn't. They sort of forced their way into the church and claimed it. They heard a message of liberation and claimed it, and are the largest part of our churches now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. We had another question come in. It says, I love this discussion around language. All languages are the language of empire, and while I see and hear the language changing, it is often changing to new empire. In what ways can the church, we as scholars, pastors, and lay leaders, begin to change the language to one of people, society, and humanity?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, as an Anglican, we are so particular about sharing our language together, having prayer books in common and all that. And one of the struggles of that is, like, this morning, or yesterday I did a service where the prayer that was read was just really patriarchal on purpose. It was trying to make a link to Jewish heritage, spiritually at least. But in doing it, it was all patriarchal. And so I thought about changing it. I just one of those days where my brain was tired and I didn't want to get it wrong, and I wasn't sure which ones to say. But you also don't want to perpetuate these. Like, you kind of know what they were going for. They didn't get it quite right. It's from the 70s. I think it's an ongoing work, and I try to use as much language that is human and particular as I can. And I get it wrong. Like, I don't like empire, but I also don't like kingdom. And I don't think that's right. I don't think commonwealth, like the remnants of empire, is really the best we can do. I don't think that works. I don't think God as king actually really works. I don't think it shifts in the way that the Jesus Caesar language is cutting, or that the Magnificat is cutting to empire. I don't know that we've captured that, but I'm not sure, because I know, in places where there are lords, like where I come from, or in the UK, using the word Lord is really problematic. In the US, it's not used for anything but God. Mm-hmm. So I think language is really interesting, right? And I don't think there's a clearly, right, not a blanket answer, but I think keeping it really humane. So one of the things I like to like calling Mary a woman, I think actually really does something quite disruptive, because it's so particular and humanizing. And I think there are things like that we can do in language that bring the story to us and to our experience. But I would agree, I don't know what is the right word for a larger community that isn't subjugated by a person in power that's drawing all the resource to themselves, which is what all of those titles are. And I honestly don't know. And I think we should struggle with that. And even the idea that we have a uniform language, again, this just came up in our service a couple of days ago, that English is uniform enough that we can read, right? Which is because English starts to be written, and you get our prayer book, and then you get the Bible. It takes away the particularity of all the kinds of English being spoken all over what is now England, right? And as it did all over, all the particularity is gone. There's one way to speak English, and then there's power organized around that. At its best, some would say it means that wherever you're born, you can access that through education. That's what we're all taught. But there's this other problem of you've lost all the particularity of the land, of the practice, of heritage, and you've dulled down the experience of a people to one version. And that language has taken out, like, how much experience is lost, again, in the way the flies can't talk, right? How much is lost in our story because I don't have that word. And I feel it as an immigrant, like all the words I don't have in Malayalam. What is lost that my mother can't tell me?
Mm-hmm. Right.
A lot. Like what can, what, because she was taught English. Anyway, so that I don't, there's so much that's lost to us. There's so much we try to reclaim. But right now in this moment, in this physical particularity we live in right now, there's so much to claim and write and tell, right? And I think that's a huge part of the work of people of faith.
Right. What's your how would you understand iconography then? Where it gets away from words, but it still has an image. We have there's a scholar at Westar, Ali Katus, who's doing iconography on. They found some early printings of Jesus or images of Jesus that are take the Galatians male and female, and it's shocking in an exciting way. And I'm wondering about the role of iconography and how important that is or could be now.
Yeah, I know more about it in India than I do for Christians. Just again, because I come from traditions that are not like don't have much iconography. So and again, and in India, I mean, it's an amazing colonial history. We had churches when the Portuguese came. They tore them all down and rebuilt churches in their style. So we have all these weird like Italianate and Portuguese kind of churches that look like little cream puffs all over Kerala, and I just find it heartbreaking. Like it's gone. It's whatever was there. So many of those old buildings are gone. The sites are there, but the buildings are gone. But in India, you see a lot of you see images of deities that the image themselves critiques the modern story of Hinduism. The gender ambiguous deity is the beautiful body in India historically, is the beautiful body. No getting around that, right? The black body, the blue, the blue body for black is the beautiful body. And it's written, the language says that is the beautiful body. And that it completely critiques what is said, what the beauty products are and what media tells you, what the government tells you, what your mother tells you. And it has survived in the tradition, in images, in sculpture and painting, and in how we write about the images. So I hear that. I think it's, and I'm much less aware of it in Christianity, but I guess the obvious connections I would make are the Ethiopian church, and what you find in the Middle East. But if there's more to reclaim from that, I think that's fantastic. I also think it's where we see in Christianity in Europe, what is retained of traditional practices that the Catholic Church is so wiped out. What is retained is often in images.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in the Americas as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question from one of our scholars, Susan Elliott. She writes, wants you to say more about how empire believes in and evangelizes its own goodness. She says, I'll read it exactly. Your comment about how empire believes in and evangelizes its own goodness is a pivotal insight. Could you say more?
So Isabel Wilkerson in Caste. So that, I mean, if you haven't read it, you must read it, because I think it's one of these books we all read where we know all the parts, but then she just puts them alongside each other. And I'm horrified that I hadn't made the connections, and the connections are horrifying. And so one that she makes, I knew these parts, but I had not put it together, is that when the Nazis were putting together the Nuremberg laws, right? When they were deciding how the Holocaust would happen, before they had imagined the Holocaust, but as they're beginning to create segregation based on race and creating race for them in a particular way, they sent scholars to the United States to study in our universities. It's so devastating in our universities, right? Where we all go in our religious departments, our divinity schools, our economics departments, our political science departments, to study at the PhD level. These people are studying how we had structured our race laws, how segregation worked. And so then she writes about the minutes, they took minutes of the meeting in detail, their meetings, because they knew it was historic. And so they talk about how horrifying, how over the top, how just too much American race law is. It's just too much. Like we can't go there, right? Just that's excessive. Is these Nazis like saying, we're not, like, that's nuts. That doesn't make any, it's illogical. As they're deciding how to be anti-Semitic and write that into their own law, right? And they talk, but so they say, as they're saying, it's just more like we're not going to go that far. Nobody would accept it, and it's ludicrous. They're also saying, but how is it that Americans are so barbaric in their law and in their practice, and yet retain among themselves and in their reputation internationally a reputation of goodness and innocence? And when I read it, it's like, as a preacher, I've preached about it so much, that the American fundamental ideal across the political spectrum that we all hold of ourselves is that we are good, that individually I'm innocent, like screw, all these things, but I'm good. And that's not true necessarily. I don't mean that we're not created in goodness, but this need to be innocent, I think, actually shortcuts so much of what it would mean to honestly look at ourselves. And I've talked to my parents about this, and they would say that is not anything they were raised with, that an Indian was essentially good or innocent, a Malayali was a good person. They would say they live in a complex system within which they have some privilege and power. They're subject to some privilege and power, and they have a responsibility as Christians to build a certain kind of society, to work towards that. That's actually that's an unusual thing to hear from an American. And one of the ways American empire works is around that innocence.
Right.
Like, how can I be racist, right? Like,
I'm a good person. Yeah, right. That's right. Okay. Well, I thought I would close on this. I heard you talk about, you told a funny story about when you were at Union going with a Scottish friend to the synagogue or Shabbat services, and it was a come as you are service. But I guess it was the leader of the service talked about rest and about how rest allows you to see a glimpse of the reign of God's justice.
Yeah.
As we close tonight, I thought that would be an interesting, if you say a little bit about rest and about how important it is in this culture that is grinding us to the core as a function of empire.
Yeah, in this time when it's so hard to rest, right? When so many of us are at home and there's no rest at home now, right? I feel it because I can see my bed from here and I sit here all day and work, and and I like the place that is my rest is gone. I think that's true for all of us. And I say that from a position that feels to me of enormous privilege. I don't know how to get there, right? So that story is that we were going to B'nai Jeshurun, which I'm sure many people know on this call, on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a brilliant synagogue with brilliant leaders, brilliant community. And we had been sent there with our world religions class to experience the service. And the Scottish friend and I went to the Come As You Are Shabbat service. And we had no idea what that service would be. I had only experienced that in people's homes with friends. And so I remember what's great about it is he very innocently, he was like, he walked in, he was like, where do I get the wee hat? I was like, I don't think we're allowed to call it that. And we went, it was downstairs, and the rabbis had guitars and sang and played to us and invited us into this deep place of rest. It was just beautiful. And so, but one of the insight he had, which again, it's like Wilkerson's, I had heard it before, I didn't understand it until he said it, that on the seventh day God rested, and he said, and that was the completion. It wasn't finished on the sixth day. Creation was finished on the seventh day when God rested. That it was completed in God's own dreaming and imagination, like the fullness of it. And because what are we but God, right? What is creation but God? It is completed in rest. And so on the day of rest, when we stop our work, we bring into our own consciousness a glimpse of the reign of God's justice. And I don't have the right word for that whatever that's supposed to be called, but whoever does, I'd love to know. But that perfection, that ideal, comes into play, and the truth of it, that glimpse that we all desire is because it exists. It is. But in that teaching, it was that, but it comes to play in that rest. It does not come to play in our work. It cannot come to play in any other way, but also is also informed by the work of our week, right? That work isn't bad. Like, we've been out in the world, and so we might even have a different glimpse or a better glimpse, but that work, which is the wrong word, but of the rest, the point of that rest is that we are drawing more of it into being and it's an essential component.
Thank you. I wanted to close on that in thinking about how we can operate as practitioners in this world and how important rest is, especially now. Thank you, Winnie, for taking your time tonight to speak with us and to share your wisdom with us. For those of you who are joining us, I want to remind you that this talk is being recorded and will be available in a couple of different formats. It'll be available on the website. I believe it'll be available on our social media, on Facebook. It'll also be emailed to everyone who's registered for this conversation. Also a reminder that next month, November 4th at 8 p.m., we'll be having a talk back about this conversation. We'll lead a debrief, and also we'll be able to ask more questions and have more conversations about the role of empire from the Bible to today. That is also just for Praxis members. So if you'd like to join Praxis, then please do so. It's just $1 more than your associate membership, the base membership. And then our next quarterly conversation will be on Wednesday, December 2nd at 8 p.m. We always meet the first Wednesdays of each month at 8 p.m. So December 2nd at 8 p.m. will be our next conversation. We'll be releasing more information about that soon. So thank you, Winnie. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And it is 8:55, so we have 5 minutes to pop our popcorn, to get our soda pops and glasses of wine for the debate, the vice presidential debate. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.